Hello and welcome to episode 24 of that 60s recording podcast, the podcast that has conversations inspired by the golden era of recording. My name is Joe Montague and I am your host. You'll no doubt hear at some stage during this introduction a digger going past. I'm recording this in my kitchen because my girls are back at school, which is great news. So I don't have to go upstairs into my little office anymore. I decided to bring my recording rig downstairs. And we live basically on a building site, so you'll hear a digger going past, I'm sure. Okay, so it's been an interesting couple of weeks. If you listen to last episode, you'll know that I had a very, very minuscule mention in the Times newspaper in the Enterprise section. And as a result of that, the amount of listeners I have has risen quite significantly. So if you're new and listening to this, welcome, hello, and I hope that you're enjoying sort of going back through the archives of the podcast and listening to some of the interviews I've done with other people. And if you're not new, then hello and welcome anyway. Okay, so this episode is an interesting one. It's a new format I'm trying where we discuss the life of somebody who is no longer with us. I mean, I suppose it's not new in the sense that the very first episode of the podcast was me discussing the life of George Martin. So I guess it isn't new, but somehow I sort of lost that and started to try and find people who were actually involved with the 60s recording and still around now. But I thought, the more I thought about it, the more I thought it wasn't fair to leave particular people off just because they're not with us, or perhaps because their stories have been documented already. I think it's still worthwhile getting viewpoints on those things. And if we've got a lot of younger listeners, they might not have read up on these people. So I'm talking specifically about quite well-documented people involved in 60s recordings like Phil Spector or Joe Meek, who are people who are on sort of my list of subjects I'd like to discuss and sort of talk about the lives of. So anyway, with that in mind, today's episode is me discussing with two chaps called Leslie Baldock and John Briggs the life and career of Bobby Graham, who was a 60s session drummer from the UK, and he played on, I think, something crazy like 15,000 sessions, which is ridiculous. I mean, we're back in the day when you'd be doing 3 sessions a day, and in each session you'd be doing 3 or 4 songs. I mean, it's madness. And embarrassingly for me, as a drummer, I had never even heard of him. And I've been obviously listening to lots of him now, and it's just insane. I mean, clearly I'd heard him before because he's played on so many hits that, you know, if you listen to any Phil Spector stuff, he's played on a lot of that kind of thing. And actually, what am I talking about? One should eat my words. That's Hal Blaine on a lot of that. Anyway, I'm babbling now. So yeah, it's just an interesting one. So I hope that you enjoy this episode, and hopefully, if it seems to go down well, I will continue with this format as you know, part of the sort of collection of things that we do here on the podcast. So the conversation starts with Leslie talking. We sort of just dived straight in. We got on a Zoom call and just dived straight in. So the conversation starts with Leslie talking about why these guys are interested in Bobby Graham and how they sort of came about to be interested by it. And it was just too good to leave off, but it starts in a bit of a funny place. So anyway, I hope you enjoy this conversation, and I will see you on the other side. Here we go.
Just tell you why we both do this thing, partly because we both care about music, but partly because we're both speaking for someone that really can't speak for themselves anymore. I knew Bobby as a friend. We were friends for 5 years before I even knew he was a musician. Our boys were in the same class at school together. We were neighbours, and we used to have a lot of summer barbecues. And Bob would often be on his own. His wife worked. His son was like 10 or 11 years old and out of the house. And he would smell the barbecue. And I'd hear this, "You having a barbecue, mate?" "Yeah." "And can I come and join in?" And sure. And this probably happened 15 or 20 times over 5 years. He was a great talker. He had loads of stories, but not one of them was about his musical history.
Wow.
I never never said a word about it. And he became endeared to the whole family, not just myself, but my wife and my 3 children who kind of grew up with him. And one day his son Sean was around the house and we're watching a Bond movie. I can't remember which one, but we're all big Bond fans. And you hear the dun 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 dun, and Sean says, "Oh, my dad played in that." Sorry, my dad played on that. Your dad played on the James Bond theme music. Yeah, he did. Why didn't you ever tell me? And I didn't believe him as well. And Bobby's name is Robert Neat. So I went and this is the early days of the internet. So we're then talking about plugging in your computer, hitting the thing Bob, the old noise, getting on there, typing in Google, the page coming down really, really slowly, typing in Robert Neat, nothing. So about 2 weeks later, Sean comes back and I said, "You lied to me, mate. You know I love music. You know I love Bond. And you said your dad played in a song. There's no musician called Robert Neat." "Oh, his name's Bobby Graham." Bobby Graham. Screen explodes. So I went round to his house. I said, "Bob, did you ever play?" "Oh, I did a few things, mate." And at that point, I still had no idea of the wealth of history this guy had been. And little by little over the years. And he told me stories. And so all the things that I generally do are based on stories that he told me. And through that, I got to meet John Briggs, who helps out on the site that we run in Bobby's name. And, I mean, this guy was there. He knew Dave Clark 5 members. He is a particularly close friend of Mike Smith. He ran the fan club. He used to go drinking with Mike and stuff like this. And my only regret out of all of this is that I wasn't there at the time. Everything I have is based on little stories that have been told to me.
Wow. I mean, that's crazy that you lived next door to him for so long. And you just didn't know. I mean, what a humble beginning.
Well, in its way, it's one of the reasons that we became good friends, because we were friends. It wasn't me and Bobby Graham. I was friends with Robert Neat. And when Bobby played his last concert in a little pub in Hartford, it was called The Barge. There was about 20 or 30 of us there. And one of them was Rod Argent. And I sat with Rod all night, talking away and stuff. And about 50 times during the night, someone came up to him and asked him a question. It's amazing how many people walk into pubs with their own demo of their own band. He got given about 10 demos. Wow. And I felt sorry for him because he just was going to see his mate. And even though it was a little pub with 20 people there, he got disturbed about 50 times. Well, that never happened with Bob and me. So I guess we had 5 years of apprenticeship. And then we got to find out about the music stories a little bit more.
That's fantastic. I mean, I think it's an amazing story. So I should say that we're doing things a little bit differently, so we've kind of dived straight in, which I'm really pleased about. And I'll just say that I'm joined here by Leslie Baldock and John Briggs, who have kindly agreed to come and speak to me about somebody they know a lot more about than I do, Bobby Graham. So we've heard from Leslie, and hi, John. Nice to meet you.
Hi.
Thanks so much for both of you for taking the time to do this. We really appreciate it. It's a slightly new thing for this podcast, as I've said in the introduction, that there's a lot of people who, as you've already alluded to, are no longer with us, who were involved in the 60s music scene. And rather than just completely passing them by altogether, I thought it would be a nice idea to try and put together episodes based on those people, which is exactly what this is going to be. And I am embarrassed to admit that until fairly recently, last couple of years, I hadn't heard of Bobby Graham. And I think that is I would suggest that in people of my generation, that's probably quite common. And to say, I mean, I've got some numbers here. He played on 15,000 recordings, 13 number ones, 40 top fives, and spent over 3 years in the top 40 of the UK charts. So to say I've not heard of him up until recently is unbelievable.
No, you have heard of him. Every time I listen to the radio, yeah. Every TV program I watch, my wife gets bored of me going, "Oh, well, Bobby was on that one."
Yeah,
it's madness. And as you just said in your introduction, that the fact that he maybe he didn't want to mention it because he didn't want to talk about it anymore, or I don't know, maybe he was just a humble guy. I didn't know him, but it seemed amazing that he isn't dining out on it and you know have
He did a little bit. You'll find with most musicians in that era, because they didn't, perhaps the ones that didn't really make it, the big ones, didn't get the recognition. They do like to talk about it, but I think in his case, it was my apprenticeship for being a friend. Yes. He didn't want a friend of Bobby Graham. He wanted a friend for Robert Neate. And
I suppose it was sort of a happy accident that he became friends with you and you were a music fan. You're somebody who's primarily positioned to understand the significance of what he's done.
I had to hold myself back with my enthusiasm.
John, would you mind just telling us a little bit about how you knew Bobby and so your history in the music scene?
Yeah, it's quite interesting because I actually fell out with him.
Oh, right.
Before I became friends with him. I've been involved with the Dave Clark 5 since I was a teenager. And as he has told you, I ran the fan club and ran fanzines, did interviews with them all, everything. And for years, like many Dave Clark 5 fans, I thought it was Dave Clark playing the drums. And occasionally I would meet people at record fairs, things like that, and say, it wasn't Dave Clark playing the drums, it was just Bobby Graham. And I used to get fed up with it. And there was a magazine article, I can't remember if it was Record Collector or one of those magazines, about somebody wrote in and said in the reader's letters, did Dave Clark play the drums or was it Bobby Graham? And the magazine, being very sort of diplomatic, said, oh no, it's definitely Dave Clark sort of thing. And Bob wrote in and said, no, it was me. And I wrote in and said, no, it was Dave Clark. Get lost sort of thing. And of course, building up over the next few years, I interviewed people out of the Dave Clark 5, not just the group members, but people who'd been involved in record producing, the sound engineers, everybody. And all them then tell me, well, no, it was actually Bobby Graham. So I thought, well, I best get in touch with him. And I sent him a letter, got his address, sent him a letter apologising and said, look, I'm very, very sorry. I've now been told it was you from very good authorities. So, I'd just like to apologise. And a couple of days later, phone rang. It's Bobby Graham here. And I expected to get told off, No, you're very, very nice. And from then on, usually on a Monday tea time, the phone would ring about 5 o'clock. It's Bob. And he would just have a chat for an hour. Just about, not particularly the Dave Clark 5, but about his career in general. And we became very good friends, but I never actually met him. I talked to him for years on the phone every Monday night, but I never actually got to meet him.
Wow.
In person.
That's incredible. I love that. I often work with, in the sort of job I do at recording drums with people, I often speak with people, as I'm speaking with you guys, who I don't meet, and I feel like I've got a fairly close relationship with some of them, and it's a really cool thing, and I think it's a testament to musicians in general that they can just chat and they just want to talk about stuff, and I love that. I think that's a fantastic story. So I wonder whether it might, if we perhaps start from the beginning and talk a bit about the beginnings of sort of Bob's career and the way it unfolded, and then you guys could just chip in with with tidbits of information as you kind of see fit. Does that sound like a good way forwards?
Yeah,
So I'm actually not sure where either of you were based, but Bob was born in where's the beginning of my thing here in Edmonton in North London, so primed to have a career in, London was the centre of the music scene back then, really, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And he was part of an elite group of session musicians who could be likened with the Wrecking Crew in America.
Yeah.
Although we don't officially in the UK have a sort of Wrecking Crew sort of likeness, but it's...
Bob had a name for them, didn't he, Les?
Yeah, the London All Stars.
Oh yeah, nice. Did they? Am I right in thinking they recorded some music under the London All Stars?
Yeah, they did indeed. They did several things. They did a lot of French artists. Michel Polnareff, Francois Hardy, Eddie Mitchell would all come across to London to record. They also did their own album, which was reproduced in a day, and I sent you a copy of the back page. It's called British Percussion.
Yes.
If you look at the list of musicians on there, it's just incredible. And Jimmy Page didn't remember playing that. He wrote 3 songs with Bobby and played lead guitar on that, and he didn't remember doing it.
That's madness. I mean, for me, growing up as a Led Zeppelin fan, the idea that Jimmy Page was involved in the session scene at all just blew my mind, you know.
Well, and John Paul Jones. So the core group would be Bobby on drums, John Paul Jones on bass, Jimmy Page and Big Jim Sullivan on guitar, and you got people like Eric Ford on the scene, Alan Wayhill. There were so many top musicians, but the nucleus of the group was those guys.
Was Vic Flick in that group?
He played in the first Eddie Mitchell album. And then he was later replaced by Jimmy Page.
Because going back to where you started, the Bond theme is Vic Flick.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, yeah.
I know Vic quite well. He lives out in the States now.
Oh, wow. It just, there was clearly a sort of, as you say, like a nucleus of guys who were reliable. And, you know, the Shell Tell Me podcast I recorded, almost wish I'd have done it the other way around now. I'd love to have had this conversation first and then spoken to Shell. But as I kind of got from him, it was pretty standard practice back then to get a backing band to come in and work on the tracks.
Well, they had 3 hours to record 4 songs, and a lot of them were good musicians. It wasn't the fact they couldn't play, but could they play 4 songs perfectly in 3 hours? And not many could.
You had people like Eric Ford who could sight read music, and they would just hand him the sheet of music and he would go in and play it. Now, you couldn't do that to your bog standard dancehall band, you know, or garage group, as they would be called these days. They couldn't do that. They couldn't sight read music. A lot of them couldn't even read music. And yet you had people like Eric and Vic Flick and people like that would just, I can play that and go and play it.
But more that, they played it with feelings. It wasn't just a question of reading the notes. They understood music as well, because Bob used to criticise the solo on the Cliff song, Move It, because the guy that played it note perfect, but without feeling.
It's interesting that with kind of I mean, everything that I think of to do with 60s music is comes from sort of a Beatles knowledge. So we're talking sort of early 60s almost, where the Beatles kind of broke the mold of studio time being in 3-hour blocks. And then when sort of Trident Studios became popular, and studio time began to feel like, I suppose, a bit more relaxed. And we're in the days now where studio time was probably extremely sought after. Difficult to get and expensive. So
that's correct, yes.
Yeah, so they're just getting musicians who, you know, as you say, the musicians in the band could certainly play it, but can they do it under pressure in that 3 hours and work that quickly?
And also, sometimes they could transform a song. There's a song by a French artist called Michel Polnareff, which the song itself is quite substandard. But on that particular session, the performance by Jimmy Page, Bobby and John Paul Jones is exceptional. And they take what's a pretty average song and they make it something special.
Am I correct in thinking that Bobby was a bit of a jazz fan in the first instance?
Yeah, just a bit. One of the things that I chose to do after he passed, unfortunately, was to help his family go through some of the stuff. And 2/3 of his record collection was Stan Kenton.
Wow.
He was the biggest Stan Kenton fan. And for his funeral, he'd written down for what he wanted. There was a particular piece, and he put in the brackets, "Do not fade out." He wanted everybody to hear the whole piece. So, yeah, big Stan Kenton fan.
Amazing. So did he ever speak to you about how... so the beginnings of his drumming, and did he? I'm assuming he played. I mean, I know from a bit of research that he liked to play along with Ted Heath Orchestra and Ronnie Verrell, who's obviously I guess, the generation previous to Bobby in terms of session player.
Yeah.
And a lot of his background came from jazz influence.
Well, one story Bobby told me, and it's quite documented in his book. Yes, he was a big jazzy. He was a big fan of Ronnie Rivera. I think he was his favourite early drummer. And he had a knock on the door one day, and he was asked to go and join what would become the Outlaws, doing a season at Butlins. And he said categorically no. And they said £15 a week. He said yes. At that moment, he ceased to be a jazzer.
It's that seems to be a bit of a common tale. I mean, my drum teacher, who I will speak to eventually for this podcast, is of the same generation. His name's Ronnie Bottomley from up in Leeds, and he talked the same thing. You know, he was an ardent jazzer, and then got involved in summer seasons, and exactly what you've just described. And for me, that seemed like, you know, the sort of being in those rock and roll bands or R&B bands is an amazing thing, whereas these guys did it because it paid good money.
What I can't work out, and I'm still trying to work out, is which was the song that turned Bobby from being a jazz drummer into the legend, the rock drummer he became, because he was with Joe Meek in the early days, Joe Brown, with Marty Wilds, with the John Barry Seven, and the drumming then was more of a jazz influence. There was more accompaniment, more subtlety. But by the time, obviously, of the Dave Clark 5 and You Really Got Me, the drums were the driving force. And I asked Shell this question, do you know the one song? And he kind of thinks it was You Really Got Me was probably the one that actually, where Bobby changed their history for sure, and, you know, became that drummer we all know and love.
It would either be that one or Glad All Over. They were Glad All Over, I think, was slightly first. It was November 63. But one of those two, definitely.
So,
they were the ones where Bobby really came to the fore. It
seems, a really common story among the guys who were involved in 60s music, that, you know, being from North London, then it was an old school friend, was it not, who invited him to come and do the summer season at Butlins?
Yes.
Yeah, and, you know, the fact that he went to school together with that person, and it all just fell into place in a really kind of in a really nice way, and it seems to be a really common theme among working musicians from the 60s that happened, and the Outlaws seems to have been a bit of a band with some pretty decent pedigree.
Yes, slightly. Yeah, of course, we had Chas Hodges in there as well, who people know obviously from Chas and Dave, but he was a seriously good musician. He played guitar initially, got converted to bass for the Outlaws, but obviously became known for his piano playing. But he was on many, many sessions as well in the 60s.
Did Bobby talk much about his time with the Outlaws and working with Joe Meek and that group?
Yes, he did. He hated Joe Meek. And I mean that. Bobby was a very kind man. He told me about Joe Meek before I saw the Telstar movie, and I have to say Con O'Neill is absolutely brilliant, because the person he plays in that movie is what Bobby described to me, literally word for word. But they'd walk into the session, and Joe would record some noises on a tape and said to the band, right, go and play this. And, you know, for Telstar, it would have been, he couldn't even do that in tune. And, you know, the boys had to make something of it. And he was incredibly gifted. He was absolutely legend in the pioneer music, but very, very stressy. And in the Telstar movie, it's Clem Catini, it's shown as being thrown. It was actually Bobby who was being thrown down the stairs in real life. And Clem wasn't on Johnny Remember Me. Bobby did that one, but they kind of did that for the film. But yeah, Bobby was thrown down the stairs, followed by his drum kits. So he was quite glad to leave in the end.
I can imagine. It was about that time, working with the Outlaws and Joe Meek, that Bobby was starting to get into a bit of writing. From my research, there's a particular song, Crazy Drums, that I've read that Joe Meek was credited for creating, when actually it was Bobby that came up with the whole idea for that.
And he didn't get a penny for that as well, Bobby. I think he got a very small check from the PRS when he was in his 60s. But like many people, he happily signed away a contract. He went in there with great intentions, and he was told by Joe Meek that his name would be on the label to give it credibility. But it was Bobby's concept, Bobby's showcase, and Joe Meek got the credit and he got the money for it.
It must have been really frustrating for him. Do you think? I mean, does he have a chip on his shoulder about it at all, or is it just brush it off?
No, he didn't have a chip on his shoulder, and it's part of growing up. You know, if he was the only person that happened to, that would be, you know, a thing. But it happened to all the bands back in those times.
It was common practice in those days. Ron Ryan quotes Larry Page, especially as putting his name on all his songs, and Dave Clark did it as well. A lot of them did it. A lot of the record producers got their names on songs that had nothing to do with writing. Yeah, it's common practice.
It feels like a word I've written down is murky, and I kind of alluded to it with my conversation with Shell Talmy, that it seems, as you've just said, it was confusing who wrote the songs, it's confusing who played on the songs. It really was, you know, as we sort of say now, as show business, you know, it was just a case of what's going to work, what's going to get this selling the best, not who actually did this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it makes it really difficult to do any research. I mean, I haven't found a comprehensive list of the tracks that Bobby played on. It seems really hard. I
only know of 200 or 300 of them. He didn't know. One of my greatest joys, though, in all honesty, and this is one of the, you know, sincere pleasures, was listening to Tom Jones' It's Not Unusual. And there's so many people claimed that played on that. It was actually Ronnie Verrill who did the single. And only recently I found the demo that Bobby did, and Bobby played in it. But we listened to it together in his room, and he said to me, do you know what, they say it's me, but it's not, because that's Ronnie. And I used to nick that particular lick, and he literally taught me how Bobby played the drums and told me how Ronnie played the drums. And I was listening to the guy who was involved in it, playing the record and talking about it. So when I eventually found the version he was on, I knew exactly who had performed this version.
That's fascinating. It's those little subtleties, and you know, as a musician, we get taught to keep researching further back and further back. And you know, I love the idea that you know, that Bobby was learning off Ronnie Verrill, and then was passed to Bobby, and then the next generation. And he quite openly stole that stuff. I love it. So it was about he left the Outlaws and started touring with Joe Brown.
Yes.
And that seems like it was a bit of a significant step up in terms of just the, I guess, gig sizes and notoriety. It was a bigger, a more well-known band.
Yeah.
And he was suddenly not touring in a van anymore. It was a bit more of bit more luxury.
Yes, in the past they've been in the back of transit vans, and you know, now we're talking about being part of big showcase tours where many bands would play together, being put in hotels, being mobbed by fans to come out, being recognised, being on TV. You know, all these things became, but it also came at a cost, because Joe Brown was very, very disciplined, notoriously hard worker, and he expected everybody in the band to be the same. And Bobby had troubles with that a little bit.
I get that sense from reading about him that he was a kind of I don't know, an assertive personality, perhaps, if we put it that way.
Well, the Bobby I knew was very different to that Bobby then, but that Bobby then was painfully shy. So how did he get over it? By drinking. And then when Bobby drank, he could still play the drums, but I guess, and I'm surmising because obviously I wasn't there, but I guess that's when the extra of the character came out a little bit more. Interesting.
I mean, it must have been interesting for him being surrounded by these big personalities, and then as an incredibly shy person. I mean, you know, it's Dutch courage, isn't it? And I think a lot of musicians that I've spoken to of that era do tend to have quite a personality that kind of we're describing, where it's, you know, especially drummers and rhythm section players who have to, their job is to be solid, and this is where the time is, and you don't, sort of musically speaking, don't argue with me kind of thing. And I think that it sounds similar to other people I've spoken to.
I'm going to give you two analogies here. One is that he could keep perfect time, even though he'd been drinking. Perhaps getting on the drums was different. But the Bobby I knew would struggle to get on the drums because of his health conditions. He was in really a poor state of health when I first met him. But as soon as he got behind those drums, it was like a kid.
Wow.
And all the pain from arthritis and stuff that went away. And honestly, I'd see him be lifted on a seat and then play with the dexterity that few can match.
It's that's interesting. I must bring it out, have like some sort of stored memory in him, a childlike memory of playing or something that just a switch that's flipped when when he sat there. I'm interested. I mean, this story has got to be covered. I think you probably know where I'm going. So we're talking about 1961 here, really early 60s, and it was around this time when he was playing with Joe Brown and doing these tours that they played at the Cavern, I'm not sure whether they were playing at the Cavern or just in Liverpool at the point. I'm supposing it was at Liverpool Town Hall, perhaps. Or
no, they played at the Cavern, and I sent you one from the New Brighton area as well. But they did 2 shows up in Liverpool. And
they went out drinking after the show, and Brian Epstein was there. And the famous story is that it was around the same time that the Beatles weren't getting on with Pete Best, and Bobby was actually asked whether he would consider joining the Beatles at that time.
Well, this is one of those stories that not many will believe unless they were told it, and I was told it face to face by a person that I trusted implicitly. And yes, there's truth in it. He was asked, but at the same point, Joe Brown was number one. He only knew the Beatles because they were the group that supported them. They were very good. And he had a family and a life in London. So it was like, the way he told it to me is, do you want to be part of this outfit, mate? Nah.
Yeah. I think the quote was he'd never heard of them, or who's heard of them outside of London, or, they're only heard of outside of London. It was something like that, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah, something like that. But, and again, people didn't travel the way they do to gigs now, so the London crowd and the Liverpool crowd would be completely different, and he probably wouldn't have heard of the Beatles, but in Liverpool, they were absolutely legendary at that time. And we are talking 61, so the beginning of their career. But he definitely was offered it, and in later career, when Ringo was ill, he was offered the chance to go and tour Australia with them, and he was too busy.
Wow, I didn't know that part of the story. That's really interesting.
Yeah, then Jimmy Nichol took over, of course.
But did Bobby nearly join the Beatles? Not really. He was asked, would you be up for it, mate? That's basically as far as I got.
While we're on this subject, is there any truth in that he was considered for the Kinks job at one point?
Well, I'm going to tell a story here, actually, I've not told, and again, this was told to me by Bobby, but Ray and Dave would keep in touch with him. And I'd like to take a moment, if I can, just to say thank you to these guys, because they were the first band that openly acknowledged the use of session musicians, and nothing has been done to their reputation. And they're part of the reason that Bobby still has got his legacy. They really are. But they would keep in touch with him regularly. And this is the way he told the story to me. I'd go around and see him for a cup of coffee. Oh, Ray's been on the phone. He wants to get the band back together again, but he's annoyed with Dave. Next week, Dave's been on the phone. He wants to get the band again together, but he's annoyed with Ray. They always were talking about getting the band back together, and they did ask Bobby, who couldn't have possibly done it because he wasn't anywhere near healthy enough, would he be interested in drumming for them? As to been part of the Kinks in the early days, no, I don't think so. Never. Mick Avery always was a good drummer. It's a bit like having the sub in a football pitch. They brought a new player in. He was on the bench until he was ready to play. When he was ready, he was in there.
That makes sense. I mean, it makes sense that these discussions may well have taken place fleetingly, just like having a few drinks after sessions or whatever. But, whether anything formal ever happened, you don't know. So,
well, as a little side, I mean, John could tell about many stories with the Dave Clark 5 guys, and when he'd go out drinking them afterwards, and over a few beers, people say a lot more things than they would do when they don't have a few beers.
So this is around this time that he started to sort of dip his toe into session work. So we're talking kind of 1962 now. and he'd left Joe Brown's band, but previous to that, I've written here that he was recording a picture of you, and which was being produced by Tony Hatch, or Tony Hatch was there, and that was where it sort of started. You know, do you want to come and work on this session? Do you want to come and work on this session? And he started to work with John Barry, and I suppose that the music scene at that time, I mean, probably it still is now, but was quite tight knit. And once you've done a good job for one person, it got passed around. Did he speak much to you about the beginnings of that, and how he kind of started to get his way into a steady job working sessions essentially, and not touring anymore?
Not really. He talked to me a lot about being a session player, kind of from when he started, but not how he got into it. But John would know a lot more about that kind of era and how people got into the jobs.
Yeah, I think you're right. It was very close-knit. You know, the big names, the John Barrys and people like that, would keep the same musicians together and use them on. I mean, John Barry 7 backed loads of different artists, and individuals from that group would then back other artists as session musicians. So yeah, it was a very close-knit group.
It seems that, I mean, we've already kind of spoken about it a little bit, but the big session, and I've done inverted commas there, you guys who are listening to the podcast can't see, the session players were Ronnie Verrell and Kenny Clare was doing a lot of sessions, and these guys, I mean, I studied in jazz, my history's jazz, and they sound like jazz players to me. They're very jazz players. And one of the things that sort of put Bobby apart from them was that he had a great sort of R&B feel. You know, we're talking like the days of early Beatles as well, where it was kind of American music almost, American feel.
Yeah, and I guess that actually came from either the Kinks or these Dave Clark 5 sessions. And, you know, Dave Clark, I think, was quite inspired by American music as well, if I know correctly. And so many bands were, because when the ships would come into the place like Liverpool, the people that had been out in the Navy, had been to America, would bring these records back. You know, the Beatles were so inspired by Motown and black artists. So I kind of guess, you know, that they kind of nicked that sound a little bit.
John, what's your... go on. I'm interested in your experiences in this.
One of the other things was that at that time, the American Air Force had many, many bases in England, and they would have dancers on at the bases, and the British groups would tour the American Air Force bases doing these dances. And as people like Mike Smith and Dave Clark have said in interviews, they would hear these, you know, in that gap between their sets, the jukebox would go on and they would hear this American music, and they weren't hearing in England, and that's how they got into it from the American Air Force bases. So
we're kind of talking very almost. I'm trying to picture a timeline in my head. It's kind of I suppose they'd be doing that, and then it would infiltrate into the recording scene. I mean, everything seemed to work very quickly back then. It wasn't, you know, people didn't take the time over albums like they do now, and they presumably it all happened quite fast. And then there was this changing of the guard in, you know, I know I'm summing it up in a very crude way, but there was, you know, the changing of the guard from the sort of jazz, almost military trained musicians into this more sort of relaxed American Motown R&B feel. I mean, I've got an amazing quote that, well, I find interesting that I'm going to read out. That said, so this is from Bobby's book, I'm assuming, that it said, Ronnie Verrell and Kenny Clare had been around for a long time and both were big band musicians. Ronnie had come out of the Ted Heath band and Kenny had come out of the Johnny Dankworth band, and neither were particularly fond of rock and roll music. They had a great big band jazz feel and would play exactly what was written on the drum parts, and if a fly landed on their chart, they'd play it. Whereas I couldn't read, so I had to rely on what I felt was right, and I played loud. My trick was, if the singer took a breath, do a fill-in. And I was one of the first new generation coming in. Jim Sullivan was already in, and Jimmy Page did the same thing. He couldn't read a note, but he had a great feel.
Yeah. one of the trademarks about the Bobby sound, and as I said to you before, I'm not really a technical drummer, but leading into the chorus, Bob would always fill with 3 or 4 big hits of the snares all the times. So Bob would really build to the chorus, and like famously on stuff like All Day and All the Night, and there's a bit of it in You Really Got Me as well, where Ray Davies had heard on a Buddy Holly record this tap 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 on the snare, and he wanted it incorporated in there. And the funniest thing, when I see a band cover You Really Got Me, and I've seen so many bands cover it in the pubs, not many of the drummers get it. They don't quite listen to it. They don't do that. It just brings you to the chorus. And that's why Mark, the drummer, when I kind of watching them in the band, have they paid that much attention, or are they just going, through the motions out one of the many songs they covered? But yeah, I guess Bobby's big thing was bringing you to the chorus, and really he punched those drums. He was probably the loudest snare hitter before the likes of John Bonham came around.
I find it really interesting that one of the things that I enjoy most about when I work is speaking to the artist who's written the song, who often isn't a knowledgeable drummer. And it's those little tiny details that you've just described that's what everybody's listening for, whether they know it or not. And I think it's lovely that the way that you've just described that, because that is the tiny little subtleties that make a drummer as good as they are. And the fact that Bobby, there's one specific example I read about the You Really Got Me, where the riff is at the beginning and he does a snare hit before he comes in. And it seems like such a small detail, but I think Shel Talmy spoke about, not with me, but in an interview, about that being just that moment was incredible. They decided to keep it, and it lifted the song, and suddenly it kind of brought the song to life, putting that one little hit in.
Yeah, and I didn't really speak to Bobby directly about this, but I've read up on it as well. And it wasn't intended. He was caught out. He wasn't quite ready. So when, and I don't know if you've been to see Sunday Afternoon, for example, the theatre show, but it starts off with them in a dancehall band, and I was not sure where we were going, and then it got to the bit where You Really Got Me, and then when they play it in the theatre, it's 3 times as loud as anything you hear before, and you jump out of your seat and you hit the drums. And that's exactly what he did. And then it was like, shit, I'm on a ride now. I can't go with this. And I think that was a part of the reason why he played the way he did on the song. And let's not forget that when they recorded this, the Kinks were nearly out of contract. If that song hadn't been a hit, there wouldn't have been Sunday Afternoon, Waterloo Sunset, Days. There wouldn't have been those songs because the band would have been dropped.
I just find it really interesting. I can imagine the way they were all working at that time. That Bobby was presumably doing 3 sessions a day most days, and would have been just. I don't know the story of that exact session, but presumably he was doing something else that day, and I can imagine it just being another song he was doing, and I can imagine exactly that situation of him not being ready. I can feel the same feeling, and then just doing it. And of course, nowadays they'd have probably snipped it out, and they just kept it in, because that's the way it worked then.
And the famous, you might have to beat this one, but the famous "fuck off" from Dave Davis is in there because that was on the take, and they couldn't edit it out, so they tried to, on an overdub, they tried to sing over the top of it, but apparently it's still on there, and they kept it because it was on the take, the one they had to keep.
I just think that's brilliant. There's a good example of that in Hey Jude, the one that they didn't notice. It's kind of disputed in Beatles world, but yeah, it's that exact thing that they just had to keep it because it's there, and once it's mixed in, isn't it? It seems like he was doing. He was earning a lot of money at that point.
At that time, yeah, and a lot of it went down the pub as well. You were talking about 3 sessions a day. He would do 10 to 1, sort of 2 to 5, and then 6 or 7 till 10. Then they would all hit the pub, and quite often he went jamming, and he jammed with Hendrix one night in a bar in Soho.
Wow.
About 1 a.m, and then we'd get up next morning at 7 o'clock and be off again. That was their life, 6 days a week.
They were only paid about £6 a session, though, weren't they?
Yeah, £6 or £7 a session. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in today's money, that I guess what would that be about?
Probably 50 quid, I would have thought. 50, 60, something like that. Maybe 100 at the tops. I don't know, but it wasn't going to buying the house, that's for sure.
I guess living costs were lower, and he was young and enjoying himself. I'm assuming, and he will have. He has am I right in thinking about that time? I guess we're talking sort of mid-60s now. He had a wife and kids, and that's partly why he decided to stop touring and just focus on the recording.
Yes, I don't know too much about that personal aspect of his life. There's no doubt that he was away from home a lot, and that wasn't good for his family life. That would have been part of it as well. But with Bobby, it was always the next opportunity. After 64 was a massive year. He was on so many sessions, and 65, 66, 67, then they started petering out, and he got offered a job at Barclay Records in France, and he hopped over to do that. So I don't think it was a question of just family. I think it was a question of working and going where the work took him. But it did mean he was away from home an awful lot.
So he was an ambitious guy, and the reason I ask is because a lot of the musicians I speak to of that era almost fall into it. They find themselves in a beat band after they've left school, and then they get offered a summer season, and then before they know it, they're a working musician, and actually they never set out to do that. But it sounds to me that drums was something that Bobby fell in love with and really did want to make a career out of.
I think drums is all he could do, to be honest, and he was damn good at it. I think what you described of that character was true for Bobby. He kind of fell into it, and he went where the drums took him.
There we go. So as I say, I hope that you enjoyed listening to that as much as I enjoyed having that conversation. I find it really interesting for me to sort of navigate having two people to speak to. But I think, personally, I think it's a nice way of moving forward, and it's a nice way of covering the life and career of people. So I'm hoping that I can do more of those on different subjects in the future. I have some ideas, some that have come from you guys, and some that are ideas that I've had already that I mentioned in the introduction. Okay, so next week we have the second half of that conversation. And that just leaves me to say, if you'd like to get in touch with me, you can do that. My email address is joe@allyouneedisdrums.com. I am on Instagram @allyouneedisdrums. My website is www.allyouneedisdrums. You can find information about the remote recording I do and the isolated drums that I send out each week on my mailing list on those websites. I'd like to thank my good friend Joe Kane for the introduction and outro music that he supplied for this podcast, and my other pal David Henshaw for the beautiful artwork that he supplies us every fortnight. So that's that. Have a fantastic couple of weeks, and I will see you in 2 weeks' time. All right, goodbye.